Glad you're here this morning, and I'm a little bit under the weather, so kind of forgive my voice a little bit, and we'll walk through this today, but we're glad you're here. If you're a guest, welcome, and in a little bit, Scott will give you some direction as to how to introduce yourself to us, but we're glad you're here. You know, I was thinking this past week, man, some of my worst jobs were when I was in college. Can anybody identify with that? Man, from scrubbing toilets to like cleaning classrooms after all the students left to washing pots and pans in the school's main kitchen. I can still remember like all of those stacks of pots and pans that never seemed to just go away. Like I would check in, and normally when I clocked in and showed up for my shift, like I had a decent attitude, like I had a decent amount of energy, and then I could begin to see the progress that I was making and trying to, the stacks were diminishing a little bit. But then, as soon as I would get like near the bottom of the stack, then here comes this next wave of pots and pans, and then that was followed by another wave, and it just seemed so impossible to finish the pots and pans, and just a difficult job. I had a bad attitude, and by the time that my shift was done, I was done. Because on top of all of that, I was on the work-study program. You know about the work-study program? To where 80% of your check went to paying for your tuition, and then at the end of the week, you would get 20% of your check. So it was like, I don't know, money for Martha and I to go to McDonald's. You know what I mean? Like it was nothing at the end of the week. And so when I was done my shift, like I was done. And so I talk about like these gauges that you have on the dashboard of your life, right? Like the physical, the emotional, spiritual gauges, and they speak to you about how you're doing, about how you're making out. And so when I was done my shift, man, those gauges were low. Now, I know, like, I should have been grateful for the job, right? I should have been happy about my job. I should have been praying for the students while I was washing pots and pans. And I should be glad about the small part I was playing in their nutrition. No, I wasn't any of that, all right? So don't judge me. But so the last thing I needed when I finished my shift was for something else challenging or bad to happen. You know what I mean? Like a flat tire on my car, or like a fight with Martha, or getting back to my dorm room and my roommate like infringing on my space. Because I can assure you, if any of that happened, they were not getting the best version of Paul. You know what I mean? But that was just pots and pans back in my college days. When I look back at that was nothing compared to the difficult and impossible moments that would follow that for the next 38 years of my life. Now, I get it. It's all relative. But what was really difficult, seeming impossible in that dish room in the kitchen, that would be followed with moment after moment, seemingly impossible moments, really difficult moments at the time. You think about when you first get married and you start operating on a really small income, and you're like, man, how are we ever going to pay the bills? How are we ever going to get ahead? How are we ever going to get into a house? And then you have, like, I'm a young pastor of teenagers, and I'm trying to help parents that I don't even have a teenager, and I'm trying to help parents that have a teenager. And then you have different things that come up in your life, like cancer and an impasse in relationships. And then you deal with loss, and you deal with these steps like you just don't know what to do. Just difficult moments, impossible moments, or moments that seem to be impossible in the moment. Maybe you came into this room and you're in that space right now where you are in a really difficult place. Maybe an impossible moment to you right now. It could be at work, like it is just piling up and it keeps piling up. And it seems as if your boss or your company does not care about the stress that it is inflicting on you and on your life, your family. Or maybe you're a mom or a dad, and you're overwhelmed at the moment with work and home and kids, and they're fighting, and you're running them back and forth to school and extracurricular activities, and you're trying to work on your marriage so you have a good marriage. You're trying to be a good parent, and it just seems like everything just keeps on stacking up. Or maybe truly you are under this mound of bills and you have no idea how you are going to pay them all. Or you're in a sticky relationship right now and it just seems like everything that you do, like it just, the relationship keeps going the opposite direction. Or you're getting hit with one thing after, it just feels like waves are hitting you and you're getting beat down and you're like, man, when is this ever going to end? When am I ever going to get a break? Or maybe all of that together at the same time. And in those moments, the last thing you need is for something else to hit you. Because when it hits you, and you happen to bump into somebody else, they're probably not going to get the best version of you. Not just because your gauges are low at that point, spiritually, physically, emotionally, but because in those moments, in the really difficult moments of our lives, seemingly impossible moments, it's in those moments that we become pretty self-absorbed. Look, it's not that your stuff isn't real. It's not that your stuff isn't difficult and heavy. It is. But it's just that we have a hard time seeing outside of ourselves in those moments. Like, how are our needs going to be met? And how come people are mistreating us, and how hard has our life become, and how it seems as if no one cares about our plight. And look, we know we're not in a really good place in those moments, but we often don't know how to get out of those seemingly impossible moments that we find ourselves in. And so this morning we're going to look at the disciples who find themselves in one of these impossible moments, and it's in John chapter 6. And so if you have your Bibles, you can turn there. If you don't have your Bibles, you can hit the tap on the chair right in front of you, and that will take you to the notes, and you can kind of follow along, or the verses will be up on the screen. But for those of you who are new today, or if you have missed the last few weeks, we are past the halfway point in our current series, Signposts. And we have been in the Gospel of John, and we have been looking at these miracles that Jesus did while he was on the planet. And John calls them signs because they were meant to demonstrate or to reveal that Jesus was and is God. And they were also meant to move people to believe in him. And it's the same for us as we're in this room, watching online. We go to these passages so that in order for us to wrestle with, hey, what's happening here? And to show us that Jesus indeed was and is God, and to push us to believe in him. So before we get to this passage, and we're going to start in verse 16 today, but before we get to this passage, I want to do what we do most weeks, is kind of give you the scene and some context. And so the disciples and Jesus are fresh off of the feeding of the 5,000 that Josh did a great job last week of unpacking. And so the bread and the fish that were multiplied, that wasn't the point. The point was to point us to the supplier of the bread and the fish and the multiplication of those, okay? Because often, and this is what Josh talked about last week, we look to our stuff and we look to our abundance and we begin to worship that. And we begin to think that that's going to bring fulfillment and satisfaction in our lives. And it does for a minute, but it never lasts. The only one that can give you lasting and full fulfillment in your life is Jesus. And he is way more than enough. And that's what Josh was speaking about last week. But this feast, right, this buffet, as Josh called it last week, most theologian scholars will tell you that there are probably more like 10 to 15,000 people there when you include women and children. And so, like some of you, I've been in some mass feedings. Probably only one to this size. But normally when you go to a conference or an event and lunch is included, when you come out of a session, they have all of these food stations set up all over the place, right? And so in the circles that I travel in, normally it's Chick-fil-A, right? That's how it happens because it's Christian chicken, right? So you come out of your event, right? And there's usually these white boxes that are stacked on all of these tables. And inside, it's a chicken sandwich, it's a bag of chips, it's a chocolate chip cookie, which I don't like chocolate chip, but anyway, chocolate chip cookie, and a bottle of water. And so you get your box, and then you go somewhere, and you sit down. Well, this particular event, this feeding of the 10 to 15,000, my guess, there probably weren't food stations. And there probably weren't food lines. There were just some guys there, and they had some bread, and they had fish, and they were just breaking bread off, and I don't know what they were doing with the fish. If they were ripping it, if they were cutting it, who knows? Like, it was a miracle, y'all, so I don't know how they did it, all right? All I know is Jesus was present, and he did some crazy stuff, all right? But in my mind's eye, that had to be a chaotic situation to where there were some guys, they were just breaking off bread. People were grabbing for food and they were passing food out. And the disciples were right in the midst of that. And we learn from Mark's gospel that they were kind of missing all that was happening. I mean, they knew it was happening, but it was kind of lost. The miracle to them was lost in the madness of what was happening. The disciples, they were passing stuff out as fast as they could possibly pass it out. And then, who knows how long, think about it, who knows how long that lasted? How long does it take to pass out some bread and fish to 15,000 people? But then after that, they were on cleanup duty. Like they had to gather all of the fragments up from all of the leftover food. So it would be an understatement to say that at the end of that, they weren't the best version of themselves. You know what it is to clean up after a big party that you host, right? You're kicking people out the door like, it's time to go, y'all. Like, you got to go. And then you've got to clean everything up. You are exhausted. You are worn out. Your gauges are low at that point. That's where we have the disciples. That's where we find them. And the story that we're going to talk about today is Jesus walking on the water. Now, I would be surprised if there is a person in the room or watching online that has never heard about this story. Okay, now you might not know all of the details about it, but most everybody, if not everybody, has heard about Jesus walking on the water. So I remember for me, the first time that I heard this story that I can remember was down in the basement in children's church with a lady, and she had flannel graph up in front of me, right? You remember the flannel graph? You're sticking stuff to this board, and so I remember the paper Jesus sticking to the board, and then these paper waves, and we're sliding Jesus in between the waves for walking on the water. So that's what I remember. Now, three of the four gospel writers treat this story. So it's Matthew, Mark, and John. And so I'm going to take some details from Matthew and Mark as we work through this story. But both Matthew and Mark write this immediately. So immediately after the feeding of the 5,000 or 10 or 15,000, however many it was, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. And we learn that Jesus, after dismissing the crowd, he goes up into the mountain to pray, which was not uncommon for Jesus because he would often get away by himself and pray, recalibrate, re-energize in his relationship with the Father. But right after all of the excess food was gathered and cleanup was over, Jesus made them get into the boat and go ahead of him. Now the verb tense there, it conveys this idea of forcing or compelling them to get into the boat. Now it may be because maybe the disciples are starting to really believe that he might be the Messiah along with the other people, and they were going to make him king. We don't know what the conversation was. We don't know if it was kind of like you and your kids. Something happens and you're like, just go get in the car. Just go get in the car. We will talk about this when we get home. So it could be that Jesus was, hey, just get in the boat, all right? When I get to the other side, we will talk about all of the stuff that just happened. Or if he was saying, like, listen, just go ahead, I'll catch up with you. Or what? Like, look, I'm going to catch a boat Uber. Whatever the conversation was, we don't know. But the reason that I point this out is because it was Jesus's idea. It was his command. It was him encouraging them in a forceful way to get into the boat. And so now we can jump into the text. All right, John chapter 6. So you have a little bit of the setting. When evening came, verse 16, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. So that's about a 7 to 8 mile trek across the lake, across the Sea of Galilee. So by now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, putting them smack dab now in the center of the sea, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. Both Matthew and Mark say that they thought it was a ghost. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. So they go out in the dark, on the water, after an exhausting day, not the best version of themselves, now face to face with the waves and making this into an impossible moment. Matthew writes that they were buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Mark writes something interesting. He, Jesus, now he's up on the mountain praying, saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. And then, of course, here in John, a strong wind was blowing and the waters grew rough. The disciples, some of which were experienced fishermen, were doing all that they knew to do. And it seemed like everything was against them. And so all they knew to do is just to keep on rowing. We've all been there, haven't we? You're in the midst of it right now, maybe. Difficult moment, impossible, seemingly impossible moment in your life right now. And most likely, because this is our tendency, is that you are self-absorbed. So we whine, right? I can just tell you, if I'm in that boat on that occasion, I'm whining. You can take my man card, I don't care, all right? But I'm whining, I'm complaining, I'm starting to spiral right now. I'm having this pity party. Doesn't anybody see me? Who's going to help me? Does anybody care about the predicament that I'm in right now? Does anybody out there care? Doesn't that sound like us sometimes when we get into a difficult spot in our life? People do care, but maybe just maybe, the person sitting right next to you this morning is going through a difficult moment as well. An impossible moment in their life. See, because from the seat that I sit in, I'm very aware in this room. So you have a woman over here that just found out that her mom was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And you have another single mom that took in an infant foster child this past week. And then you have this other gentleman that just lost his wife after 40 plus years. And then this morning I got word there's a man having part of our body here having emergency brain surgery this morning. Then you have another man that has 100 projects on his desk, and there's always 100 projects on his desk, and they never come to an end. Then you have somebody else that has a son or daughter in the far country. And you have this other family that's in shambles right now. You have this other person that is dealing with a really, really difficult decision. They don't know what to do. See what I'm getting at? We all have them. We all have them online, in the room. We all have these difficult, seemingly impossible moments that hit us one after another every week. But we often don't see them because we are self-absorbed in our particular moment. What I love about the story is that the disciples, they were all in the boat. So they were all facing this impossible moment together. And while we're captured by this incredible sign, this miracle of Jesus walking on the water, what we miss is the fact that Jesus isn't only at work in the miracle, but he is at work in the moments before and after the miracle. We don't actually know what the disciples were thinking, what they were feeling, what they were saying. I mean, we can gather some truths from other texts, but the rest is just conjecture. What we do know is that in the midst of that impossible moment, while they were striving and straining and working to make some kind of progress, that they catch a glimpse of something that they think is a ghost. Now, it's one thing if one person sees something and they're like, man, I think I saw a ghost. It's something totally different when they all see it. And they all feel that this is a ghost. And what's interesting is it never occurred to them, not one of them, not just one of them, that it might be Jesus. It could be Jesus. Even after it was his idea. It was his idea for them to get into the boat. Because I thought maybe they were frustrated with Jesus. You ever get frustrated with God? Maybe they were disappointed with him. Because he sent them out there in the middle of this sea, seemingly unconcerned about what could happen to them out there. So maybe they were disappointed. You ever been disappointed with God? I mean, think about it for these guys. He used them to distribute all the food. Then he used them on the cleanup committee. He'd clean all this stuff up and gather all of these fragments. And then he forced them to get into the boat, to go out into the dark, to row across the lake as soon as they were done. And then from where he was, he could see them struggling, straining at the oars. And then he let them struggle most of the night. The other text, it says it wasn't until dawn, the coming of dawn, before he greeted them. And then Mark tells us he was about to pass them by. And then he didn't speak to them. He didn't give them alert. Hey, just to let you know I'm coming. Nothing. He did not speak to them until after they were terrified. I don't know about you, but at face value, it doesn't seem like Jesus is very loving. There are not appropriate adjectives to use for how awful that moment must have been for them. Utter despair for them, wanting to quit, hating life at the moment, feeling like everything was against them, and now there's this ghost or demon or something coming on the water. So that's some questions. Why would he send them out there in the dark, exhausted? Why would he let them struggle? Why wouldn't he come to their rescue just a little bit sooner than he did? Why would he allow their gauges, all of their gauges, physical, emotional, spiritual, why would he allow all of them to redline? Those sound like some of the same questions we ask, the why questions that we ask when we get to our really difficult moments in our life. Moments that seem impossible. Why, God? Why would you allow this in my life? Why won't you show up? What's taking you so long to deliver me? The hard truth is that some of our impossible moments come because of our stupidity. Because of just bad decisions we make. Some of our impossible moments come because of sin, our sin. Sin in our life, what we've done. Sometimes our impossible, difficult moments come because of the sin of other people. And then some of our impossible, difficult moments, they just come because sin is in the world. And so we face them. But sometimes impossible moments come directly by the hand of God, so that he can orchestrate some kind of change in us. He's in the business of transformation. So he can orchestrate some kind of change in us. So he can reveal to us who he is. And he can reveal to us his power in the midst of the change. So Mark tells us in his gospel that their hearts were hard. They're still blinded in some way to the fact that Jesus was and is God in the flesh and that nothing was impossible for him. Because think about it, this entire moment where they were, it was all orchestrated by God. The fact that they were in the boat, the waves, the wind, the physical distance from Jesus, his approach toward them in the dark, walking on the water, all of it was his doing. But they didn't see him in it. They didn't see him in it. They even expect him in that. Neither do we. Really? In that moment, all that they could see and think about was what was seemingly an impossible moment. So here's the question. Is it even possible? Is it even possible not to be overwhelmed by our difficult and seemingly impossible moments, but to be able to see things differently and to think about them differently in the moment? Is it possible for us Not to get so self-absorbed that we're damaged to ourselves, we're damaged to other people, we can't even see what's happening outside of us and around us. And as I look at the scripture, the answer seems to shout back at me, no, it's not possible without any help. See, because we handle our impossible moments and difficult decisions differently. Often, I can speak for personal experience, we try and muscle through it. We just try and bow up, we try and muscle through it. But what happens is our gauges all start to get low. And we find carnage all around us, even within ourselves or in the lives of people around us. Maybe some of you are there right now. You're just trying to muscle through stuff. And you're seeing that it's not working for you. It's not working for the people around you. So some of the times we just try and muscle through all of our moments. Other times we just take on this Elijah complex. And so some of you are familiar with Elijah in the Old Testament. He's a prophet of God. And so he had this big victory. But then after the big victory, this queen wants to kill him. So he runs away. And he gets to this cave. And God meets him in the cave. And God says, Elijah, what are you doing here? And then he has this all self-absorbed pity party. That's what happened. Yeah, I'm the only one. I'm the only one, and nobody else is as zealous for you, God. And God's like, that's not true. I mean, he probably didn't say it like that, okay? But he's like, that's not right, Elijah. Like, there's a small army. There's a small army just like you. But see, you can't see that. You can't see that because you're just so self-absorbed. So you muscle through it. You could have Elijah complex. Or you could just blame other people. That's easy. It's not me. And you start blaming other people for where you are. And you know what that causes: isolation and bitterness and unforgiveness and all sorts of relational problems. Or you can do what Matthew records. I want to read this. But Jesus, in Matthew chapter 14, verse 27, but Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. Now those words, it is I, are interesting in the original language, and all three gospel writers handle them the same way. Matthew, Mark, and John. See, in Greek you can say, I am, in a couple of ways. One is you can say ego, which is where we get the word ego. Or you can say eimi, E-I-M-I, which is a tense of a verb, means to be. Now, in all three of these passages, it's ego, eimi. He uses both. They all use both words together. Similar to when God came to Moses, and Moses asked, hey, who are you? And he said, I am that I am. And so when Jesus comes to them on the water, he says, ego, I me. And I don't know if the disciples, how that captured the disciples, if they remembered all the Old Testament stories of God's power over the waters. But Peter replies, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water. And I love the invitation of Jesus. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You have little faith, he said. Why did you doubt in this impossible moment? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down, and then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. Remember, sign isn't about the miracle, it's about what the miracle's pointing to, and they saw it. What seemed to be the source of their impossible moment, the wind and the waves, ended up being the vehicle to which Jesus travels, on which Jesus travels to deliver them. Jesus walked on the water. I know we've heard it so many times, but he walked on the water. He showed his superiority and his authority over his creation and over that moment, that seemingly impossible moment of the disciples. Jesus is bigger and more powerful than your most difficult and most impossible moments. He is. He's bigger and more powerful than that. The problem isn't actually our moments. Even though that's what we see, that's what we get self-absorbed in, that's not the problem. Our problem is our inability to look past the moment and see Jesus walking toward us. That's our problem. The one who is able to help us through the moment. And here's what I love about this story that's often overlooked. No one on the boat was looking for Jesus. But that didn't mean Jesus wasn't interested and concerned, aware of their impossible moment. Even though they weren't looking for him, they didn't initiate this interaction with Jesus. Like, somebody help, Jesus, please help. No, they didn't initiate that. It was Jesus coming to them in his love and grace and mercy. Don't miss that. He cannot deny who he is. A God who loves, God who gives mercy and grace. He didn't come to condemn them. He came to reveal himself to them in their impossible moment and rescued them. He approaches us the same way. And in this moment, he initiates the first word, but then Peter responds. He said, if it's you. Peter still wasn't sure. He wasn't sure that it was him, but he responds the only way he knows how, and he presses in, and that's our first response in our most difficult and impossible moments. It's to press into the one who is Lord over the moment. And I know what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking, Paul, like, I have been pressing in for some time now. And I don't have the deliverance. The miracle hasn't shown up for me. And again, I just want to tell you that Jesus is not only in the moment of the miracle. He is in all the moments, before and after the miracle. You see, for Peter, for a brief moment, listen, for a brief moment, Jesus became bigger than the impossible moment. When his focus was on him, he became bigger than the impossible moment, but it was short-lived because he looked away. He looked away from the only one who could help him in that impossible moment. Our perspective about what is happening in our lives changes when our focus is on Jesus. He's the only one that can help you. Yeah, you can get some sympathy from people around you and some help. But at the core of your being, the only one that can help you in your most difficult moments, in your impossible moments, is Jesus. And that's why in step 2 of trusting in his will versus our will is so crucial. Because obviously Jesus did not want Peter to drown. You see that, right? So let me ask you a question. In your impossible moment, do you really think Jesus wants you to drown? Do you think he wants you to drown? Or can you believe that he has a plan for your life and that he comes with power to save you and to give you life? Trust the work that Jesus is doing in your life. Even when you can't always understand it or see it. A lot of people give Peter a hard time for taking his eyes off of Jesus, but the fact is we all do it. We all do it in the room, watching online. But what's important to see here is that Peter took a step toward him and he was close enough to be caught by him, which is step 3 in our impossible moments. Reach up when you slip up. We all will, at one time or another, slip back into our self-absorbed, poor is me posture, doubting in Jesus' plan as our focus goes back to that impossible or difficult moment. The difference should be that when that happens, we look back to Jesus, expecting that he will capture us, he will catch us in his grace. So let me ask you, what's your difficult moment this morning? What seems impossible right now in your life? Are you just buried in that? Are you just self-absorbed in that? Or are you looking for Jesus? Do you expect him to be there? Do you expect that he has a plan for your life? Or are you doubting that he even cares? Do you know this morning that he sees you and that he cares for you? Do you know this morning that Jesus is bigger than your most difficult, seemingly impossible moment? If you believe that, then press in to him. Look for his will, not yours. And when you mess up, just reach out to be captured and to be caught up by his grace.